Let's get a let's get a basis of understanding before I tackle the subject matter to which most realists talking about. And he's not the only person in the thread where this comment come from that said the same thing when we talked about Satan never being punished on the previous video I did yesterday, based off of Devil's Daughter 162. There are many stories in our society today to which we believe that the story is exactly how we have heard it all our lives. How many of you have watched Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory? It may surprise you that the Oompa Loompas in the original story were pygmy slaves that Willy Wonka bought in Africa and then transported in crates to his factory. But we grew up with Gene Wilder's Willy Wonka, and they're just being these Oompa Loompas that he saved. And that is what many of us have believed from our childhood. And without hearing the original story, we wouldn't have any idea that there was an original version that is very different from what we believe today. So a person would argue, who have never heard the original story, that he saved them and that they gleefully work for him. So the story has been changed. How many of you know that no more than 200 years ago, the word awful was not something that was terrible? It meant to be full of awe of something, meaning it could be good or it could be bad. If a person was very upstanding and they did something heroic, I may be full of awe of them. You know, I might find them to be awful, or they may find me to be awful towards them, meaning I'm full of awe towards them. But as it started to become related to tragedies, to things like storms and things of that nature, it took on a negative connotation. And if used today, we would only see it as something negative. The Hurricane Katrina was awful. The Twin Towers bombing was awful. The bombing of refugees in Palestine is awful. We would only see it in that framework because that is what we have grown up with it, not realizing that it had a different meaning no more than 200 years ago. Things have changed. So when we look at this Revelations 12:9, and it's talking about the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the world, we have to understand that this is a 1st century at best, 2nd century more than likely writing, meaning it was written after around 95 CE or later. Now, it's most likely that it was written in that time frame, in the time frame of Domitian, because they were expecting Nero to come back, and Nero is the 666. Nero is the beast. That is what his name accumulates to numerically in the Greek, or if you were looking at it, well, in the Greek, what is that? In the Latin, in the Greek, but if you were looking at it in the Latin, then it's 616, which is why there's a difference between the two. But when they talked about these things, the idea of the great dragon or the Leviathan was something that was in previous cultures and ancient cultures hundreds of years prior, thousands of years prior, depending upon which group we're talking about. If we're talking about the Babylonians, then we're looking at about 500, 600 years prior. If we were talking about the Kemetic with Apep being the great dragon, then we're talking about 6,000 years prior. That this idea was already there of a great dragon, of a serpent that fought against the god of the sun, Ra, in Apep. That the great serpent of Tamu, or Yamu, was defeated by Hadad. This story was told 500-600 years prior. That Baal killed Tiamat, the great dragon, and formed the heavens. This story was told about 7,000 years prior. So we have these, 700 years prior. So we have these previous stories that dealt with the great dragon, that dealt with a Leviathan centuries prior. And as far as the Satan, we have about 8,000 years prior, the Satan from the Sumerian, which meant the administrator, but then the first Semitic language, the Akkadian, it meant the adversary. That this story, this usage of the word of Satan, was in place for about 6,000 years prior to Revelations being built. And much the same way that writers of today have taken older stories and made it into our understanding today, so did the writer of Revelations. Took old themes that the people would have easily been able to identify with and corral them into his understanding of if Nero returned, then he would persecute the Christians and become this great beast, this Antichrist. So it is not proof in Revelations that the serpent, the devil, the Satan were one and the same. This is just what the writers during the time frame of Revelation decided to put in their book in reference to Nero. And as far as the star falling down and his angels, we're talking about, as far as Enoch is concerned, almost 1,000 years prior that this story is being told about Enoch and the Watchers. But it's a 6,000-year-old story in the Sumerians, with the Igigi coming down and being with the daughters of men. So we have this older story that they can identify with, and they're bringing them in to make it part of their story and to give it a little twist to it to make it their own. And then as the centuries went by, and we get into about the 4th century CE, this is when your Christian fathers decided that they were going to, by the 4th century, because it started much earlier actually, but by the 4th century, because it started in around the 2nd century, they began to merge Lucifer, merge the Satan, merge the Diablos, which is where they get the term devil. It's like Diablo Los. And then take all of these and make them into one being, so that people would stop asking questions in the churches. And that was done 1,500, it was solidified about 1,700 years ago, solidified in Christianity. And that is why you accept it and believe it today, because you're believing and leaning on the understanding of these men and how they wrapped Christianity up in a nice little bow, so that made it easier for you to digest, and made it so that you can digest it continuously and make it relevant to you, when its true relevance was simply talking about Nero and utilizing the format of talking about Tiamat, talking about Hadad, talking about the Watchers, talking about the Igigi, talking about Enki, and making them all into one being, and talking about the planet Venus as well, and making them all into one being to satisfy the narrative to which they want you to believe, not the one that's the actual truth. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.